But I'll start with probably the most important point, and that's how dangerous bad ideas are for humanity. And Keynes put this brilliantly back in the 1930s, saying that the main source of bad ideas is economists and political philosophers. And the world's ruled by their crazy ideas. So practical men who believe they're devoid of intellectual influences, I can think of a few nominations in the other parliament, are usually slaves of some defunct economists, madmen in authority who have voices in the air that are distilling their frenzy from academic scribblers a few years back. And this applies both in the area that I'm going to be talking about initially, which is government finances, and then also ecology, because this claim was made by a non-mainstream economist about 60 years ago, and about six months ago, this economist from King's College literally said what Boulding accused economists believing, that it's possible to have infinite growth on a finite planet. Those are the madmen who are in charge of our economy. It's no wonder we're suffering. So bad ideas on both macro and climate have caused the predicaments we're in right now, decades of economic stagnation, and an impending collapse caused by climate in the very near future. Forget about it being a century away. We'll be lucky if it's a decade away. Now, to start with why economists get the government finances wrong, they use a model of supply and demand analysis, two intersecting lines. Wow, that was really cool in the 19th century. They're still doing it now. And this is one economist giving that sort of lesson on YouTube. This idiot has almost 1 million subscribers. Okay, I've got under 100,000. I'd like you to help me catch up to him. He's a well-meaning idiot. That's the danger. Somebody who's stupid and doesn't know that they are is far more dangerous than somebody who's malevolent and knows they are. So he's explaining a model which the Bank of England over a decade ago said is simply wrong. And what have economists done? They've ignored it completely. When they gave the Nobel Prize to Bernanke, his so-called scientific paper had no mention of this paper saying that the model he was using was wrong. Banks do not use don't use two intersecting lines to decide how much to lend you. They use double entry bookkeeping. And I've invented a software package that lets me model the economy that way. So what they believe happens is that when the government borrows, it borrows from households just as firms do. And what it shows is that all borrowing is a transfer from one group of non-banks to another group of non-banks. So this is just very rapidly showing a very simple model showing, okay, let's imagine that's the real world. So households lend to firms, and then firms pay interest back to households, and households lend to the government. That's the model that economists have in their mind. It's all the idiots at the other House of Parliament that also accept this because that's what they learned in PPE and so on and so forth. And nothing is happening, as you'll notice on the asset side of the banking system here. Banks are simply being conduits to enable households to lend to firms and to the government. No money is created. All you've got is a shuffling of existing money between bank accounts. And because the government is required by law to issue bonds which are equal to the deficit plus interest on existing bonds, that causes an exponential explosion in the level of government debt. And when I simulate this model, which is what my software is designed to do, you see that even a 1% of GDP deficit leads to catastrophe. GDP remains relatively constant because there's no money being created. The level of government debt, you can see on the right-hand side, is rising exponentially, whereas firm debt is rising linearly. That is inevitably going to reach infinite levels of debt. There's absolutely no way that would actually be allowed to happen in practice. The government would collapse long before you reach levels of showing 1,000% of GDP debt there. Deficits are clearly unsustainable. Rachel Reeves is right, there's a black hole, okay? But the model's wrong. It's a myth to say that banks behave that way. Households don't lend. I've made the mistake of lending occasionally. I would not recommend it, okay? It's banks that lend. And the government doesn't bank at private banks. It banks primarily at the Bank of England. So all I have to do is modify that in the software and show exactly the same flows, but in different locations. Whereas beforehand, nothing was happening on the asset side of the banks. Now there's a lot taking place there. And rather than being a transfer of money from one account to another, lending creates deposits. This is the argument the Bank of England made in 2014, and mainstream economists have studiously ignored it. I have seen one citation of that paper in mainstream economics so far, trashing it without understanding it, making a couple of absolutely crazy assumptions that economists believe the same. Now, when you look at the Bank of England, There's a lot of action on the Bank of England as well when you modify the model from the fiction to the real world. And what you can see is that if the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it creates reserves. Okay? Now, those reserves are things which used not to earn any income for banks and are non-tradable. So when the government offers to sell bonds, that is an asset swap for the banks. It's not borrowing money, and it's an asset swap that makes them better off. If I became governor of the Bank of England, I'd shut this stupid debate down in one day. I'd buy all the outstanding bonds and wait for the banks to complain about their lack of an income source. That's what would happen. The bank could do it in one day. So what are the consequences of this realistic model? What it means is the crisis disappears because now government money creation and money creation by firms borrowing is causing GDP to grow. The debt levels, rather than going exponential, both stabilise. This is the system we're actually in, and those idiots believe we're in the system that the textbook teaches them. And this is why they make fundamental mistakes about how the world operates. Rather than what we call the deficit being the same thing it would be for you and me if we spent more than we got back on our income, this is how governments create money. The government creates money by going into negative equity for itself, negative financial equity, and that creates positive financial equity for you. So rather than calling it a deficit, we should call it a fiat. And rather than being zero or negative, which is what those idiots in the other Parliament House are aiming for, it should roughly be equal to the rate of economic growth divided by the velocity of money. And that way the amount of credit money and fiat money would remain relatively constant compared to each other. So these decisions that the Tories and the so-called Labor Party have made, they're not hard decisions, they're stupid decisions. And the key error is to see a surplus as saving and a deficit as dissaving. This is what they're taught in the textbooks. This is Mankiw, probably the most popular and asinine economics textbook on the planet, saying savings, the budget service is savings and a budget deficit is dissavings. That's true for you and me. It's not true for the government. The government creates money when it spends more than it takes back in taxation. It also sees savings as the sum of what the government and the private sector do, when in fact the sum of all is zero. Okay? If the government dissaves, you save. If the government saves, you dissave. Okay? It's the exact opposite. It's like imagining a seesaw can have both on the bottom and both at the top at once. It's completely crazy. So these are actions, you take a look at what's actually going on in terms of money creation. Those ones I've marked there cancel out. Nothing happens with those. But anything which happens on both the assets and the liabilities side of the banking sector creates money. And then you look at gross private savings, that is equal to the great gross private increase in money is borrowing by the firms, plus spending by the government, plus interest by the government, minus tax. But net, when the borrowing comes with the debt, obviously, net savings is spending minus tax plus government investment. That's the negative of the equity the Treasury gets into. One is the opposite of the other. So if the government doesn't run a deficit, you dissave. You have less money in your bank accounts. Surpluses destroy money. That is the opposite of what the mainstream believe. And the deficit empowers other groups. Now that's talking in terms of economic growth going on forever. Of course that can't happen, but who told us it could? Economists. In 1972, a brilliant report called Limits to Growth said that unless we change direction, there'd be a serious catastrophe by the middle of this century. That was in 1975. The collapse began then. If we took extremely serious actions, stabilising population, reducing resource use by fourfold, reducing pollution the same way, and diverting resources to food production, we would avert the collapse. But none of those were done, of course, and that's half a century ago now. So what happened instead was economists replaced their own preferred models with the neoclassical ones, and they make assumptions you would not believe. If your children made these assumptions in a school assignment, you wouldn't let them leave class until they changed them. They literally assume that being undercover will protect you from climate change. They literally assume that the weather and temperature patterns across the planet can be used to predict what's going to happen with global warming. So they say 7 degrees of warming reduce the rate of economic growth by 0.14%, whereas scientists say anything above 5 degrees, we go extinct. So that's the gap between what economists believe and what's going to happen. Catastrophic change is going to happen this century. damages will be far larger and far more immediate than economists believe. In that situation, the private financial system is likely to collapse. The only thing that is going to work is fiat money creation, and that's how we fought World War II, by fiat money creation. As you can see, the debt, government bond, outstanding bonds were higher then than they are now. So if you want more background than I can give in 10 minutes, those are 3 sites to go for me, and I now give an online course as well with much more detail. Thank you.
I want to talk about wealth inequality. If you want to know more about wealth and inequality at the moment, I am actually at the moment producing a series of videos on wealth. Video number 5 came out of this morning, and there are 12 will come out. They will finish over the next couple of weeks. So my YouTube channel is called Richard J. Murphy, which is incredibly original and novel. And you will find me there. And there's a lot of material, some of which happens to be similar to what I'm going to tell you now. Why am I interested in wealth and inequality? Because if we give more money to the people who have the least in the UK, we will all, and I mean without exception, all be better off. That is my fundamental message to you. We have to redistribute wealth to generate the income that everybody wants. Let's have some background facts. These are all based upon the Office for National Statistics in 2022, and they produce data on household wealth. I've actually translated that to individual wealth on the basis there's 1.9 adults per household, which is near as damn it right. You know, come on, these are very big numbers. On average, the bottom 10% of people in the UK who are adults have wealth of £12,835, which will be their phone, a bit of furniture, some clothes, and not a lot else. That's what on average they have. A person who's in the top 10% will have 2.35 million of personal wealth. A person who's in the top 1% will have over £5 million of personal wealth. The top 20% of people in the UK own 58% of the wealth. The top 10% own 37%. That is more than the bottom half. We are a country of massive wealth inequality. And think about the consequences of that for a moment. On average, a person in the top 10% has £300,000 in the bank. Think about the difference in reaction to the unexpected bill if you have nothing in the bank and if you have £300,000 in the bank. This isn't just an economic measure. This is a measure of absolute stress as well as absolute poverty. Never forget that when we're talking about economics, we're talking about real people, real lives, and real situations where people suffer because of the consequences of what is going on. How did we get here? I was asked to mention, how did we become so unequal? So I'm going to run through very quickly how we became so unequal. By the way, if you are interested and have access to BBC iPlayer, there's a great programme on at the moment, just out, called Humans, on anthropology. It's very good about this, by the way, particularly number 5. I watched it last night by pure chance. Recommend it. How did we get here? We enclosed land. A few people made the land their own. Let's call them out. King Charles III and his predecessors, the Duke of Westminster and many others, said land was theirs and they charged other people for the right to access it. They didn't own it, they seized it. And then they said, you must pay. And we still do, all of us in some way or other, pay rent, either in the price we pay for our houses or to occupy. They gain, we lose. Then, of course, we colonised other nations because we didn't have enough land here. So we went overseas and we either took their people as slaves or we took their land and exploited it. When we claimed their land, we exploited the mineral rights as well, whether it be iron, gold, copper, you name it, we exploited it. And of course, we still do. Oil and gas and everything else, all of those come with a massive price paid to the landlord. Remember, all the oil and gas extracted in the UK, most of it comes out of the North Sea. And who owns the North Sea? Oh, King Charles III gets a fee for every single little bit. Yet again, exploitation alive and well. And then we got to banks. Another way in which we exploit the world, as Steve has already mentioned, they make every single pound that we use out of nothing. In a technical sense, if you want a loan from a bank, they put £10 debit in your current account, £10 credit in your loan account. The two add up to nothing. They made the money out of thin air. It's all done on a keyboard. There is nobody else's money involved. And they charge you for the privilege of tapping that keyboard, and they charge you a great deal for the privilege of tapping that keyboard because they've been given the license to abuse ever since 1844 in the Bank of England Act of that year. They do that. And now the tech companies want to do the same because they want to do it with crypto. Everywhere you see that. And of course, when we talk of the tech companies, let's mention monopoly, because monopoly is real. Monopoly is there to exploit you. Does it really cost £100 to create a copy of Microsoft and its various licenses? No. How much does it actually cost? About 0.0000001 of a penny. The download cost, that's it. Now, economists will tell you that you should price where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Microsoft have not heard that. They charge you £100 or so. They exploit you for the £99.999999, which they extract from you, which they should never be able to charge. This is how they get wealthy. And then there's one other thing that makes people very wealthy, and that's the tax system. Let me just look at this. I wrote something called the Taxing Wealth Report 2024. When I started it, it was going to be 10,000 words. It ended up as 126,000. Whoops, got that one wrong by a bit. But doesn't matter. I wrote it in 50 installments on the blog, so people actually read it. Nobody's read the whole thing, I'm quite sure. I'm not even sure I've read the whole thing. But if you really want to go and find some data on how we can actually end up with a better tax system, there's lots in there, including 30 ideas. But I showed how the tax system works. The bottom 10% of income earners, not wealth owners now, income earners, pay 44% tax on average. And that's because they pay things like the BBC licence fee, if they're honest, and it's a flat rate tax. And they pay council tax, which is absurd, because they shouldn't be. But they are, because it's the last government put it on them. And they pay VAT on everything they buy, just the same as everybody else does. And they spend every penny they get, which the wealthy, of course, don't, because they have money left over at the end of the month. That's why they're wealthy. I can't read what that says, but I think it says 2 minutes. And so we have a tax system which is deeply unfair. And if we include increases in wealth in the figures for total increase in financial well-being in a period, rather than just income, and wealth has gone up staggeringly high over the last decade or so, the actual effective tax rate of the wealthiest in this country is 22%. The bottom 10%, 44%. What a fair and just society we live in. And let me give you an example of how unfair it is. We've had the whole row about personal incapacity payments, and I have friends who are on PIP, and I know how hard it is to get it. It's a nightmare. And you get around 9,000 a year. On average, people in the top 10% of taxpayers in the UK get £9,000 of subsidy a year from the government to support their savings, either by way of pension tax relief or tax relief on their ISA accounts. £9,000 of subsidy a year. They don't have to go to Agnes and be quizzed and interrogated and be given grief. They just submit a tax return and they get the money. It's grossly unfair. We have a system that benefits the wealthy from beginning to end. The trouble is, finding where wealth is, and I put a video out about this morning, is very difficult. I promise you, after 42 years as a chartered accountant, and having done many wealth valuations in that time, it's incredibly difficult to find, locate, and tax wealth. And I know lots of people are incredibly keen on a wealth tax, including Gary Stevenson, and we are going to do a video together, I understand. The point is this: if you want to tax wealth, it's much easier to start with the low-hanging fruit. And the low-hanging fruit, I'll give you 3 examples. Equalise capital gains tax and income tax rates. over £10 billion a year, as much as many wealth tax estimates include. Charge the equivalent of national insurance on investment income, over £5,000 a year, and you'd raise £18 billion a year, vastly more than almost every estimate for a wealth tax. And if you charged VAT on financial services, you'll get £8 billion a year. So I've just told you how to raise over £36 billion, more than any wealth tax estimate.
Can you say those again?
They're in the booklet, by the way, except it says 10 billion for VAT on banking and it's 8, but it's pretty close. So we can get the money from these people, which was what I was asked to do. It is possible to redistribute income and wealth in this country, is my point. And in fact, there's many more ideas than that in the Taxing Wealth Report. So we can do this. We need the political will to do it. That's all we require.